Welcome to the first episode of the Soul and Mind podcast. Today we have a two-part question. So I'm going to read the full question and then we're going to answer each part separately. Firstly, in your view, what is the role of the unconscious in shaping a person's behavior? And second, how do you help clients become more aware of unconscious influences in their lives? So this question is going to explore a little bit of the theory and then a little bit of the practice as far as the unconscious goes. We're going to start off with Karina. What are your thoughts on the first part of this question?
Well, I guess before I kind of jump into really answering the question, I just wanted to share how much I love that this was our first question that we were starting off with, because I feel like the unconscious is such a foundational part of depth psychology and such an important place to kind of jump in and dive into. So I love that we're starting off the first, podcast episode talking about the unconscious. So if I were to share, I guess, some of my initial thoughts or kind of how I conceptualize the unconscious is that I view it as kind of this realm within the psyche of all individuals that contains what's known, forgotten, repressed, suppressed, and is also connected to the legacy of the world, our ancestors, as well as the animal or natural world. Um, and of course, I feel like based on what your perspective is, the idea or how the unconscious is viewed could definitely vary, but that's kind of my more simple, kind of condensed version of it, I would say. For me, I feel like it exists as both a repertoire that's connected to our own individual experience and the larger universal collective, which is known as the collective unconscious, or what Jung termed the collective unconscious. And in the collective unconscious, there exists potent energy patterns known as the archetypes, where these energy types reside. The archetypes are ultimately unknowable, but become manifest through images, symbols, dreams, or even symptoms. So, some examples of the archetypes or archetypal images would include images like the Great Mother, the crone, or the child, etc. Um, and so, I guess for me, these are kind of the elements or energies that I feel like constitute the unconscious. But I'll kind of pause there and open it up to Jack and Dr. Sandoval. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I just realized I forgot to introduce everybody, so I'm going to do that right now. So welcome to
Thank
Oh my
you.
gosh, can we just like redo the welcome and
Can we
like
do
put it
a
at the
a
beginning?
blooper reel?
Thank you to whoever's editing this in advance. Welcome to the first episode of the Soul and Mind podcast. I am so excited to introduce the clinicians we have with us here today, starting with Dr. Sandoval. She is our founder and president. And we also have Dr. Karina Schwab and Jack Mendoza, who are our intern clinicians here at Soul and Mind. So thank you so much for joining with us. And now that we've heard from Karina, Jack, what are your thoughts on the role of the unconscious in shaping a person's behavior?
Well, I agree with everything that Karina said, but I have probably a different structural take on it for my own purposes and understanding the unconscious because it's such a huge topic. Um, Unlike Karina, loving that this is our first topic, I was like, whoa, this is massive. I would have just started with ego. Um, that's probably easier to tackle at first, but with the unconscious, I will start at ego, because it's such a large topic. Um i i do have to break it down in several structure forms for me to get my head around it. Um so that's starting with the ego consciousness realm at first. That's where we all essentially reside. um that's where ego uses persona to have me speak here in front of you and use this persona to navigate the world. um So with that, I kind of work backwards where I'm now in the what Freud would have thought of as the personal unconscious, which is a repository as he looked at it, as he saw it, where Jung more or less felt that these were where the complexes resided. And for me, when I'm speaking in terms of the unconscious and the complex, this is where we tend to look at a lot of traumas and um, shadow thoughts. Um, and so this is the structure that I seem to work with or tend to work with. I don't get to archetypes until much later. Like for me personally, I do deal with the archetypes in my own personal life when it comes to dreams that have captivated me. I like to write them down and see who's talking to me, what's the message. Um, but the unconscious, yeah, the role of the unconscious is I think when we get to archetypes, it's very vast. This is where Karina's talked about how we are connected to the ancestors, to the larger all, as I call it. But there is that point, that area where we get to the anima or the animus, which for me is the mirror image of the persona, where the persona is looking out, or the ego and persona is looking out into the empirical world. Anima animus is looking the other way. As I mean, I've Dr. Sandoval has always said the way you look at the unconscious is the way it looks at you, and I feel that gatekeeper is anima and animus, who then turn around and speak to us, for lack of a better. I mean, it's such a big topic, right? The unconscious, and I can go on forever about this. And this is where I feel archetypes come in shapes and energize those complexes that then take over us, take over the ego consciousness. Um, and if we can go ahead and make peace with the anima and animus, that's when I feel that we can have the self transcend, capital S self, transcend all this and merge the two together through what Jung considered individuation. Um, that is my summary of the role of the unconscious in our lives, and which is very helpful and for me to understand, because it's my map, it's my blueprint on how to approach individuals when we come into therapy, into a therapy session.
I like what you said, Jack, about the archetypes energizing the complexes, because I feel like that's really how those unconscious forces start to show up in our lives and shape our personality, is when those complexes become energized and activated and grab a hold of us, and we don't even know it's happening, unless, and hopefully in the course of therapy, maybe there's a little more space that's obtained between you and your complexes, and you can kind of see them. And I guess in my hope, my goal would be to establish some kind of relationship with them and be able to dialogue with them and really kind of be with them. But yeah, but that's kind of, I think, also the scary thing about the unconscious, is that it can really kind of seep through so suddenly and without us even knowing. And I think, Dr. Sandoval, you mentioned this too, about like how we and ego always thinks it's in control, but in reality, it really exists with everything else. And um, I mean, I don't know if I want to say that it has less control, but it just, as we've talked about, it just is. And ego has a hard time with that. Um, and that's probably one of the bigger unconscious things, is being able to really tap into that just is state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is all really good stuff. And you're right, Jack. This is a huge topic in psychology. It's kind of like the topic of psychology, because most of the time when we're dealing with feelings and behaviors that cause us distress, those emerge from the unconscious psyche. You know, if we were conscious and had conscious control, why wouldn't we just feel good all the time, you know? Or pick the right partner? Just be attracted to the person that we know is best for us. Right? Or, you know, there's so much in our lives that is run by something that seems and feels autonomous to us and not available to us. And right, this would be the unconscious part of the psyche, which is vast. It's vast. And okay, I did not come up with that quote, Jack, that you said I did, which is, the face we turn toward the unconscious is the face that turns back toward us. That's Jung. He said that. And I think that we can replace the word unconscious with the word unknown. It's really everything that we just that we don't know about ourselves. It's not conscious to us. So I remember one time when I was in grad school, we amazingly had James Hillman come talk to us. I might have told this story before. And I didn't know really who he was yet. So I boldly just shot my hand up and asked this question. And I said something like, where do you think the unconscious is in the mind? And he looked at me for a long time and he said, well, sometimes I think these terms are really meaningless. He's like, why can't I just drive my car, feel the steering wheel under my hands, look out at the beautiful landscape, feel the sun on me, and just be in my life? Why do I have to worry about the unconscious? These are just terms we use and make up to kind of make sense of our experience in our lives. So I think it's important to understand there is no such thing as the unconscious in an empirical way. This is conceptual. This is all a theory about how the psyche works, what motivates our behavior. We really don't know. But the theory that Freud came up with, which basically kind of imagines the psyche to include the unconscious, which you both referred to, I think correctly, of sort of like a repository or sort of the location of all of our impulses, instincts, repressed memories, traumatic memories that the mind represses to basically protect us. All of our the thoughts and feelings we're ashamed of and wish we didn't have. These are taboo feelings, especially to the child, like rage toward the parents. You're not allowed. So all these things get kind of shoved down into this part of the mind that we call the unconscious because we're just not aware of it anymore. And then we have the ego, as Jack mentioned, which is sort of in the middle between the unconscious and what we call the superego, which is more that part of the mind that tries to shut down the unconscious impulses. So the superego you can imagine as like our conscience, or basically that part of the psyche that is really attempting to suppress anything that it deems unacceptable in the mind. And the ego is in the middle, right? It's trying to manage and look good to itself and the world via a persona that is trying to manage these two opposing forces in the psyche. That was Freud's idea of what the psyche looks like, those three parts. For Jung, the unconscious also included not just the personal unconscious, which, Karina, you talked about the complexes that are in there, which are really sort of charged collections of memories and thoughts. So the complexes are in there, but and the impulses, but also he talks about a collective unconscious, which is more like a universal awareness that we all share on some level. And this is also where the archetypes or those images, those symbols would reside in the collective unconscious. So the idea is that we each have a personal or subjective unconscious, but there are links back to the collective unconscious, which again would be sort of ancestral awareness and collective memory and collective trauma that are all in that vast repository. It's really infinite in a way, if you can think of it that way. Oh man, see, I go off the rails here, but this is a great topic, and I think really, really important for people to be able to understand or get an idea of the power of the unconscious. There's another image that Jung used of, imagine you're on the ocean and there's a little walnut shell just sort of bouncing, bobbing on the top of the surface. And the ego is inside that walnut shell and saying, okay, I made that wave and I made that wave, and this is all my doing. So the ego really has no respect, or it doesn't honor the power of the unconscious. So it takes blame for everything. It takes responsibility for everything. So, if I try to let's say, I get called upon in class and suddenly my face gets so red, like I'm like engulfed in shame. Actually, let's say I have to go up and give a public address. I have to speak publicly. And I walk up to the podium and suddenly I forget everything that I was supposed to say. Suddenly I'm overwhelmed with shame. Okay. The ego takes responsibility. The ego thinks that it's to blame for whatever happens unconsciously.
Can I add something that kind of reminded me? I was going to add it to kind of some of the thoughts that I had jotted down initially.
Yeah.
You described Dr. Sandoval, the personal unconscious, and then there's kind of the personal and then the collective unconscious. And then it made me think about how more contemporary Jungian. So I'm thinking about like Jungian analyst Sam Kimball's, and who was the other? I'm embarrassed that I'm forgetting the name, but they talked about the cultural unconscious as kind of being this intermediary layer between the personal and the collective, and how the cultural unconscious has its own basically its own memories and energies that is derived from the culture.
I I read about it through Mary Watkins,
Uh-huh.
the cultural unconscious, um, meaning, well, when I talk about immigrants or talk about Latin American culture in Southern California, we walk around with a cultural unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary Watkins talks about this, advocating that the cultural unconscious should be made conscious for the culture to progress. If the culture is trapped in whatever they're trapped in. Um, and I read about that, the cultural unconscious. I think where I differ from the idea that it's something within us, I think it's something within us when we're amongst others, and then the unconscious or anima animus is speaking through each and every one of us, going back and forth while we're all together as a culture. Because I'm a believer that the cultures are made or come about through the archetypes, within the collective unconscious where the ancestors are. And then when we are together, say all Latinos are together, there is a cultural unconscious that we all sort of share. And I don't know if this is something like what Giegert would talk about with soul, um, or the phenomenology of soul, permeating through all of us. Um, but that's what I got off of it when I read Mary Watkins' book on it, about the cultural unconscious.
Mhm. Thanks, Jack. I just looked it up. So it's a term that was derived from the work of, I believe, originally Joe Henderson, but it's talked about extensively by Thomas Singer and Sam Kimball's in their book titled The Cultural Complex: Contemporary Jungian Perspectives on Psyche and Society. So anyway, I'm just sharing that for reference.
Yeah, no, that's great. And um, for me, the complex, I mean, that I don't tend to look at complex positively. Um, for me, they're the gremlins that were sort of created through the traumas of our lives, and we suppressed them or thrown them into the repository, as Freud would have argued. Um, but they're there, and I don't see them as these, like, although they're these energy sources that take over us, and that's when we start to, like, when you're in an argument and you can literally feel yourself turning into someone totally different. Like, I understand that as being my complex taking over me. uh but I don't think that they're as powerful as an archetype. um in fact, I would think the archetype is more the one pulling the strings, um with the complexes. And that's why I feel, as a depth psychologist, if we understand that, um and walk with the client to the complexes, we can take away that power, that energy, um sort of put them away, or accept them, really, because you never really can put anything away. At least I don't think you can. You can integrate it and make it a part of who you are. um but to make it fully disappear, I don't think that's what we do. But culture complex, I mean, a lot of cultures, our cultures, have a lot of trauma. And so it makes sense for me, with the cultural unconscious, that we all walk around with this idea of, or this label of who we are. And I'm sort of going off the rails here, but it's my hope that we can make these cultural complexes and unconscious conscious to, um, our kind, so that we can maybe move ahead and move forward.
Well,
That's
yeah, I think that now you're getting to the I think a very important question of, okay, so we're understanding what is the unconscious or the theory of the unconscious. So now what? Like, what do we do about it, or how do we imagine it so that it can be helpful? And I think in a way we could say that the goal of psychotherapy is to bring unconscious contents into conscious awareness. And that's called integration. This is a kind of a technical term in Jungian psychology. A lot of times it's preceded by shadow integration. But uh, a lot of the unconscious psyche is projected outward into the world, and we don't. It's unconsciously projected, so we don't really understand that that's what's happening. Um, but sometimes we can be integrating positive aspects from the unconscious psyche. But
Mhm.
for instance, we may imagine our boss to be really, powerful or wonderful, or we might have that would be called a positive projection. So we're sort of giving away our own power. We're projecting our own power and seeing it in someone else outside of ourselves. So integrating that power, the experience of that would be that your boss becomes more, over time, more like a colleague. and not someone to be intimidated by, or, but no, they're more like you found your own power with them and now they're like you, right? So that's the experience of, for instance, integrating an unconscious projection. But most of the work that we do is actually integrating shadow projections from the unconscious psyche, which are the negative parts. So it feels like, does it feel like we covered theoretically the unconscious? Is there anything anyone else wants to say? I mean, Megan, what are your thoughts on this?
This is a topic I've always been interested in. Like since I was a kid, I was obsessed with like dream interpretations and all that stuff. So it's something that even though I haven't like studied it a lot academically, has been a personal interest of mine. And I think there's a lot of power to it. So um, I I was taking a couple notes on some of the themes that came up, and I think we um hit the main ones that I think of as well. I really liked the additions about the cultural unconscious. That was a new concept to me. And I want to read more about it. So I'm glad that Dr. Schwab and Jack both referenced a couple authors who have done work on that. And yeah, no, it's really interesting to me to learn more about the theory behind the unconscious versus just my own experiences of paying attention to my own dreams, and the parts of myself. I think you put it really well, Dr. Sandoval, when you said like if we were conscious of everything, we wouldn't have these problems, right? We would just choose to be happy or whatever. So that makes a lot of sense in how like we can remove the blame from ourselves a little bit. Like um obviously we don't choose to be neurotic, we don't choose to have disorders. And I know that it's a big focus of depth psychology not to pathologize the patient and not to feel like there's something wrong with them, and that the unconscious is something that can be befriended and like spoken to in a dialogue, is something that Karina, I think, and Dr. Sandoval both mentioned, like opening up those lines of communication within yourself. And that's something that's been really powerful for me just as an individual. And I can only imagine how much power it has over our clients as well. So I'm excited to hear some more examples, maybe as we move into the practice section of this interview, about how that works like in a session when you only have an hour a week, or an hour every other week to talk to somebody. Like how do you really make an impact on something that is so powerful in our daily lives? So I guess using that as a transition to remind ourselves of the second part of the question, it's how do we help clients become more aware of unconscious influences in their lives? Karina, would you like to start us off again?
Yeah, so let's see, how do we kind of make use of this clinically or work with it clinically? My initial thoughts obviously jump to working with dreams, images, symbols, literature, music, or even a symptom, whether it's a physical symptom or an emotional symptom or a psychic symptom. And I feel like those are all like little whispers from the unconscious, or like when we're drawn to a particular book, or we keep hearing that one song on repeat over and over again. I feel like that's kind of the unconscious. It found a way to kind of grab our attention, and it's uh normally I feel like it's easy to just maybe dismiss it or not delve too deeply into it. But when it's brought into therapy, there's really time and space to open that up a lot more and ask questions about, okay, yeah, well, why am I listening to that song on repeat? Or, why do I have like this continual tension in my jaw or in my back? What's that about? And how do I start to listen to these things in a different way? So in a way, I think that requires um, the ego to be a little more humble. I feel like that humility piece is really important when trying to dive into the unconscious. Um, and also like having curiosity and patience, because going there in therapy can feel scary at times or feel useless for some. And so, really, kind of being patient with the feelings that come up as you start kind of trekking in there, I think is really helpful. And I feel like therapy is a great space to do that in. You know, having somebody there also who can support and hold as you know as the other person kind of starts their own exploratory process. So yeah, so those are kind of my initial thoughts, on kind of how we start working with it in the therapy space.
Perfect. Thank you. Jack, do you have some initial thoughts about this topic?
Yeah, when I begin a journey to the unconscious with someone, I actually start at the ego realm, the ego consciousness realm, because it's known to the client. Um, they feel safe there, although they're coming with their problems or their issues or their anxieties or whatnot. This is what they're living with, and here is where I tend to start, um, because breaking into the unconscious can be very scary, as Karina pointed out. So this is where I tend to start. Ask questions of what's life like for them, what are they going through, talk about history, their own personal history. If there's one thing that I say to them is that they are the experts of their lives, they are the historians. I am just a guide. And then I say, just think of Dante's Inferno, and then they freak out and like, shut off the Zoom. But um that's normally where I start, is ego, and ego consciousness, that realm. And why I start there is because I try to work with the client into understanding that they are not ego. That this isn't exactly who they think they are. That persona isn't exactly who they think they are, and sort of start tearing down these thoughts and these thought patterns that they had of who they thought they were or who they think they are. You know, um, maybe they didn't like what they said they always liked all their lives. We start going there, and the whole trick is to start to see the ego objectively, to start, hear the ego's voice and understanding, oh, that may have been my father's voice, that may have been my mother's voice, and I inherited that voice and started acting that way. When we get to that point, then we can start moving into more of the unconscious realm. But it's not that I don't talk about the unconscious while we're in ego realm. I do tend to ask the client to maybe perhaps meditate on the images that are coming to mind, because I feel like the archetypes do send out those images, or the complexes come to us in images, feelings, as Karina said. Why are we anxious? Where's the anxiety coming from? Why is it there? But for the most part, if we can meditate on what's going on, if you walk in as the child, maybe something happened as a child, um, speak to the child. We are really speaking to the complex, uh, but it's easier for the individual to speak to themselves as a child, um, to integrate that complex, that thing, that trauma that's hurting them. This is how I walk into the unconscious. It's not till much later, in their therapy, do I start getting into what anima is, or the collective unconscious, all of that ancestral, the all. As I said, my view on the unconscious is We have this body, we have this ego and persona, and we're living here on this planet. And here on this planet then goes out into the solar system, and then the solar system goes out into the universe. Just as that concept happens out here, it happens inside. And it's a mirror image of it. That's how I see it. The earth is ego consciousness. The atmosphere and the stratosphere is when we get into the shadows and the complexes. And that's when we start going out further and further into outer space within, where the archetypes are further out in space. And then the whole thing is the self, the God within. But we don't get to that. I don't get to that. Sometimes I don't get to that at all. Sometimes people aren't ready for that. They just want to know why they're anxious. And then that's when I have to, instead of talk about ego, then start going into more of the neurosis, or not the neurosis, but neuropsychology. People want to talk about the mechanics of the body. Because the body, I feel, has its own, the body keeps the score. The body knows. It feels the pain. It understands the pain. But we must follow that. Always follow the symptom back to the source. So that's how I work in getting to the unconscious. And it takes time. It truly does take time. I feel that I've been working on it my whole life, really. But really for the last 8 years of my life, really been working on my own personal journey through the abyss of the unconscious, through the ocean of the unconscious. That's how I go about it.
I was going to say, I think even for me as a therapist, I'm like, I don't know that even I've been able to really say I've gotten to the source, and I've reached the end of the road and that's it. But it makes me think back to like the concept of individuating and the process of individuation that Jung talked about, this like journey into and getting to know and seeking the unconscious in a way. Is a lifelong process that's like constantly in flux. And I was thinking that I liked what you said, Jack, about the that it's the complex, like when you're dialoguing with the inner child, let's say, that it's the complex that's kind of speaking through that inner child. But it's easier for people to visualize that inner child rather than, let's say, the complex or the archetypal energy or whatever it is. And I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because the ego wants to feel like it is in control, and like Dr. Sandoval said, like it has created these things. And it's hard for it to really understand that these forces that energize the complexes are autonomous and unknowable and much larger than us. It's like, I feel like even like when we're talking about the images of the Great Mother and the crone, like these are images that maybe reflect something about the archetypal energies, but ultimately we don't know what they are or what they look like or what their truest essence is. And so it's like, yeah, if and when we can really let that sink in, it's like, oh yeah, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, what is this journey into the unconscious? And it's like, well, no wonder it feels scary going into that first therapy session, because there's something inside, whether we know it or not, that's already sensing that that's happening. Or anyway, at least I think so, but yeah.
Yes.
Can I just mention that I like how in our podcast here, we're all therapists and we're just quietly listening to one another instead of like interrupting, and just.
Well, I just about interrupted you just now as you were going to say we weren't interrupting each other. that, someone had mentioned to me recently a patient who became pregnant for the first time, and the experience of this autonomous process happening within her body was so profoundly humbling to her. And I think it gives you, it's somewhat of a parallel, to really how powerful the unconscious psyche is. When we notice all of these unconscious processes in the body, and really how autonomous they are. Like like to your point, we really are just sort of the witness a lot of times. And I think that the dreams absolutely are a wonderful way in. It's like looking under the hood, when someone's, reporting a dream, because the ego isn't there in the dream. There is a self in the dream. We call that the dream ego. But the day-to-day persona, which is really this elaborate set of defenses that is sort of this false self that oftentimes will edit out parts or feelings or repress certain feelings. In a dream, it's all there. It's all to be seen, right? And it's like the unconscious, we get to look and peer in. It's almost like with a flashlight, you're looking in there. I think, though, honestly, from my experience, most people get a real experience of the unconscious when they get triggered. And something happens. I stub my toe and I find myself having an enormous reaction. Oh, put that toy there. Why can't this, right? It's like, oh my God, the rage is like, or something minor, very minor happens, but the response is, completely inappropriate. Someone says something that reminds me of someone else, and suddenly I'm anxious. Or we have, traumatic memories that come up, intrusive thoughts, all these things. So the trigger, the external world, something happens in the external world that seems to cause something to come up in me that I didn't wish for. And so this is, I think, also a very motivating factor for people to come to therapy when they're noticing they're getting triggered a lot. We could even say depressive symptoms can get triggered. Panic attacks can get triggered. There are things, again, that just display the power of the unconscious psyche, where we really feel powerless in the face of these feelings. So that is something I think that is the role of the unconscious in our behaviors definitely shows its face there. There are other thoughts about it, like Freud thought that, the jokes you told really revealed a lot about your unconscious psyche. Things that you thought were funny is like we're peeking under the hood there. Freudian slips, you say something you didn't mean. It reminds me, I think a couple days ago, Trump was saying something about the Pittsburgh Steelers in a text, and he spelled it Pittsburgh Steelers, Stealers. We might call that a Freudian slip, where you're projecting your own fears into what you say or something like that. So yes, these are all psychosomatic symptoms, like Karina was saying, that I'm having stomach aches or, unexplained headaches. And of course, we want to check out physiologically if anything's going on, but a lot of times stress unconsciously affects the body too. So again, these are all kind of clues to what's going on unconsciously with people. And I tend to like, again, for me, when the unconscious presents itself, it's an opportunity psychologically to look and not judge it, but really witness what comes up and do the best we can to be with it instead of project it. Can we sit with it? Can we sit and be with what's coming up, in a sense, patiently, not trying to get rid of it, not trying to do anything with it. I mean, a lot of affect that comes up, it's like a hot potato, like shame. Oh, get this off of me, make it stop. Normally we try to get rid of it or push it back down. So part of the therapeutic process is to notice what comes up and actually just sit there with it and witness it. And in that, looking at it without judging it, it can now finally lift and clear, as opposed to the normal response is to try to get rid of it, which tends to shove it back down, or project it out, which keeps it unconscious. You did this to me, right? That's the cause of my suffering. Again, projection. So there are a lot of opportunities therapeutically to work with unconscious contents through triggers, through dream work. I think trying to go into the unconscious is a little tricky because it usually ends up being an ego project. It's sort of like the ego trying to improve itself or fix itself. So I'm a little suspicious around that. It's not like you can't. There are definitely ways, I think, the active imagination, there are ways we can do our best to get a look at what's in there without too much ego involvement. But I think there are lots of opportunities where the unconscious psyche shows up, and we can work with it in therapy and in our day-to-day life. I mean, every day you're going to get most people get a pretty big dose of the unconscious psyche.
That makes sense, Dr. Sandoval, what you mentioned about being wary of, going into into the unconscious, how like it can be an ego project. And I was thinking like, well, yeah, like you'd be so much more susceptible to identifying with what you encounter, or with the archetypal energies, and that being like identifying with those energies and believing it's you, and either being inflated or I don't know, maybe completely depressed or something. But then thinking about it the opposite way, like I was thinking about like shamanic journeying, or like indigenous healers who really do journey into this other realm, and like how different I imagine that is versus the ego's project of trying to journey into. But maybe I'm straying into some other topic now.
I think it's a really good distinction you're bringing up, because a shamanic approach to for instance, the collective unconscious, usually a shaman spoke on behalf of a larger group. So whether it's the particular group of people in a village, or something that everyone kind of knew everyone, so there was a shared awareness, a shared unconscious, that it I think is designed to exclude the ego. So I mean, like a true shaman tends to live outside of the ego thought system. They're not concerned with their subjectivity. They're concerned with the objective psyche that includes the community. So, a shaman's dream, we would say, tends to reflect an objective truth about the group, whereas my personal dream is really about my own thing, my personal unconscious. Now, they're really interesting conversations, and I think it'd be really fun to have a podcast where we really just focus on dreams. There are theories about the difference between a subjective dream or an ego dream and a soul dream, which actually may be speaking to something larger than just my own personal experience. And there are thoughts about how to distinguish whether it's a local dream or a more universal dream, depending upon the content of the dream. fun. This is kind of a fun topic to look at. So when people bring a dream in, we can talk about it on multiple levels. I think too, one, I mentioned triggers, but I think also one thing too, that people often are motivated to come to therapy because of behaviors that they can't control or manage. Again, that's going to be the unconscious kind of erupting into conscious life. So compulsions, obsessions, addictions, things like that. Obviously, if the conscious mind had dominion, they would be conscious behaviors. But because the conscious mind, the ego, can't manage it, they're relegated to what we call the unconscious psyche. So again, I forgot to mention those because those are really, they can cause a lot of distress, these kinds of behaviors that we can't manage. I feel like we've only touched the tip of the iceberg. Yeah. I just feel like there's so much more to talk about. And it just feels like we're just sort of flirting with the edges here, with this conversation.
Yeah, if there's talking about the tip of the iceberg and going deeper into it, the thing that I always tend as a therapist or a psychologist to kind of wrap my head around is this is who I am here. I do reside in the empirical world. I don't like to villainize the ego, because it is a part of me. Persona is me in this world. And I guess what I always struggle with, is going into the realm of the unconscious. And ego is not us. Ego is not that. It's like, well, then what is? And then we come to the self that transcends, and it's the union of the unconscious and the conscious. And that's the individuation process. But it is rather hard. And maybe I'm playing devil's advocate here, but it is rather hard to say, well, I am not. And I talk about this in therapy. I talk about objectifying the ego and being aside from it, but I do also come from the understanding that I also live here in the empirical, and it's kept me alive. I don't know, maybe you can talk to that, Dr. Sandoval.
About maybe our relation to the ego, or
Yeah.
and not. I agree. I think it can be tempting to villainize it, and to especially in depth psychology, because it is a source of a lot of problems for people. But the ego is really, really important, and it was, I mean, and again, this is another full podcast topic we could do just on the ego. But really, the ego develops it begins in infancy, and it's really the psyche's way to develop a set of defenses so that it can survive childhood, ideally thrive. So it's responding to its environment. And of course, temperament is involved too. It's not just environment. But it develops a personality that responds to its environment and is able to react. And depending upon your environment, your personality is going to be shaped. And so this persona or ego personality is really important. So we want children to develop a good, strong ego. We want them to feel important. We want them to feel like their version of reality is correct. We want them to feel beautiful and attractive and good. So these are all very strong ego concerns. We want the child to feel like they have some power in their life. So a good, strong ego is very helpful, especially for children and then young adults, because it helps you navigate and function well in the world. Sometimes we'll have people come to therapy and their ego is really fragile. It's not very well developed. for whatever reason. And so if that's the case, the therapy may be more supportive in helping them kind of complete that ego development process. Maybe someone who's like further along in life, they're realizing, man, this ego thing is so limiting, It's like, it just isn't me. I'm noticing I'm just not authentic. I'm just kind of like always trying to look good or be right, or, I'm so concerned about being in control. Who cares? Like, they start to see the real limits of the ego, because the ego really isn't it's also unconscious. These are unconscious defenses. So, and it stops developing around 11 or 12 years old. So it also isn't very mature. So it kind of runs out of steam, the ego personality. And most people in their 30s start to feel some internal conflict around it. In their 40s, it's really starting to be outlived. And, by 50, they're like, okay, enough with this. Who am I really? But still, you're right. We don't want to be in conflict with the ego. We don't want to be in conflict with ourselves. That's like creating an inner state of war.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I'm getting at, because you get to a certain point, you go through a transition in life, and you're at midlife now, and you're like, okay, I'm not about these things anymore, but I am still saying I am, I am this, I am that. And when I, walk into the unconscious, I feel that the part of I am is still trying to integrate, or at least my take is I try to integrate the unconscious with this I am, this unconscious, this consciousness. Um, so it's almost like ego, and it may not be ego, it may just be consciousness. I understand that ego is this 13-year-old running around rampant, you know. And I get it. I totally understand that, because I talk about that in my sessions. Um, but I suppose it comes together for me when I do a conscious unconscious integration, when they're both together, working side by side, not side by side, but they are connected. And I feel that you're right. If the ego is too big, if ego consciousness is too big, then it becomes ego work. Ego thinks it's a god now, because it has all of this, and it understands unconsciousness. But then I feel that if it goes the other way, then ego then disappears into this unconsciousness, and then we crack up, because now we're free falling, into this unconscious world. So I in my head, I conceptualize it as it being a sort of balance between the two. Because I am here, and I am the capital S self that transcends that's connected to the all, or what I guess Christians would call the God, or the God imago. It was Young talked about it. Which the like going back to the way I see the unconscious. um isn't it wonder that when we pray, or when people pray, they close their eyes and they go internal,
Mm.
but when they speak to God out loud, they look up at this universe. And I feel like that's a really good, like, what I was just trying to say, an example of, where are you? Are you out here, or are you in there?
See, this is tricky because, and I know we're a little bit off the book right now, so we probably won't include this in the podcast, but so much of, like, in a way, the fine line we walk is the difference between judge and what we think personally, and witness, where we're witnessing psyche in whatever format it takes. I mean, this is why, like, when we're talking about the election, the judge is like, oh God, please no, not Trump. Da, 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 it can't be this way. Rah, rah, rah. And the witness is like, oh wow, look at where we're at. Like, look how interesting that this is the zeitgeist, right? So you're kind of watching and noticing what's going on. And that would be, in a sense, ideally the psychological eye in the session with the patient. But here we are kind of as ourselves, like you said, like, if I say I am, there's nothing at the end of that sentence. It's just pure being right here, right now, pure awareness. It's not like I am Jennifer, you are Jack, you are Karina, you are Meg. No, we are. We're just here present, four awarenesses together, sharing awareness. That's it. Everything else is a story. Everything else is made up. Okay? This is what we're trying to help people understand too, so they don't have to be afraid of their thoughts, of their stories, of their memories. It's just thoughts. It's just memories. It's just invented. When we can really be here present in the moment, we're free. We're ourselves. We're safe. Like, we're here. It's okay. So I think part of the challenge we're dealing with, even like in having this conversation, so we're talking about concepts, theories, thoughts, all of the blah, 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 which in a way kind of takes us away or out of the moment with one another. And so it's almost like using a thorn to get out a thorn. We're trying to use concepts to get rid of concepts so we can actually be here. Mm-hmm. With one another. But it's so easy to go really off the rails and go deep into concepts and kind of get identified with them and say, well, this is how I feel, and this is, it's and then we kind of can create, it can just kind of take us away or take us out of who we are.
I don't remember who said this quote, but maybe you are familiar with it. All models are wrong, but some models are useful.
I like that.
I think about that a lot. Yeah.
Like that. That is fantastic. Thank you. Yes, that's a wonderful, wonderful idea. Wonderful guide. And it's sort of like you're getting the rug. If you're sort of doing it right, you're getting the rug pulled out every day. Like, I thought no, that's not it. Like, there's no solid ground with this work. Everything I think I know, that negated. But that's good. That means that, you're sort of approaching, you're arriving to where you have already always been. So yeah, I don't know how, kind of, how to relate that back to our topic. Megan, would you mind doing a formal, thank you wrap up?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us for our inaugural session of the Soul and Mind podcast. Again, the clinicians I have with me today are Dr. Jennifer Sandoval, our founder. We have Dr. Karina Schwab, and we have Jack Mendoza. Thank you so much for joining us on our discussion about the unconscious. We discovered several themes that will likely be topics for future podcast episodes. So please like, subscribe, and follow. And have a great night.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye. Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Megan.
You're welcome. Bye, guys. See you later.
See you guys.